Hello, world. This is the Know Your Place podcast. I'm Charles Altendorf. On this week's episode, I'm going to talk about novels that are set during the French Revolution and World War II. Stay tuned. Hello, world. This is the Know Your Place podcast. I'm Charles Altendorf. On this week's episode, I decided to depart from the well-known rules of podcasting. Don't record alone. Always record with someone else. But, because I'm by myself, rules be darned. And I'm also going to start and deviate from the original subject matter of the podcast to move into it. Well, everybody hang on tight. But, this week I wanted to talk about sort of a little-known concept in geography. Well, not in geography, in the public's perception of geography. And that is that space changes over time. When I would go home from college or whatever was home for me in high school, people would often ask me, well, why are you majoring in geography? Hasn't everything already been mapped? Well, that's not entirely true. You see, yes, to one degree, all the world is understood spatially by us, and there are people that have described it. Geography is one of the oldest known subject matters. But on the other hand, things always change. They never stay the same. Things are never stagnant. So on this week's episode, I kind of wanted to take this and move into sort of settings of novels. Because of my wife and because of sort of who I am, I've read several novels, and I have certain places I like them set that get me more intrigued. And the two places and times that really intrigue me a lot are novels that are set during the French Revolution and novels that are set in France during World War II. And I think this is because we sort of see France coming into its peak during the French Revolution, reaching a cultural and social apex, and then we see France starting to hit its decline during World War II before the Germans invade and occupy it. So I want to dive into this more because I think in the English-speaking world, being brought up in the United States, there's a class you take on, English Lit. At least I think everybody takes some classes on English Lit, but, we don't talk about French literature or, the peak of French culture. It doesn't really come up much, but I've been fortunate enough to read a lot about it in English because I don't know French, but I think it's very fascinating. So the reason why I say I'm deviating from the topic is I'm actually going to talk about an author who didn't really set many novels or any that I know of during the French Revolution, and that was Alexandre Dumas. And he's probably, I don't know if he's the most famous French author, but he's certainly near the top. And the reason why I want to talk about him was he was the one who got me interested in France as a setting for literature. Now, my father was a professional fencer when I was a kid, so he, I should say before I really became a kid, because he kind of hung up his professional fencing career when I was like a baby. But he was really into fencing. In fact, he used to coach it for a while at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. So when I was really little, when I was about 6 or 7, I can't remember when it was, or however early people start reading books. One of the earliest books I ever read, my dad got me or not even, I don't know if my mom got me it or who got me it, but I have a great illustrations of the classics version of The Three Musketeers. And I remember from a very young age being fascinated with that novel. And now that's probably Dumas' most famous novel. I don't know if Man in the Iron Mask is more famous, but I read that novel and I instantly got attracted to something. Not just the swashbuckling. I know that's a classic sort of thing that some people like. They get really into the fencing and the fencing moves and stuff like that, but it was more just like the setting of dealing with what we would call honor, or whatever that really means to people, you know. And you see it throughout the book, like D'Artagnan meets this group of friends, and then he has to be loyal to these group of friends, and he's trying to figure out if the girl he's with is loyal to him or not, and it's quite a crazy interplay. But what's really crazy is, as I grew older, I learned that that was only barely scratching the surface of sort of the French tugging at their morality, and I got sort of thirsty for more. And what made me really thirsty for more was when I was in high school, in my world history class, I had a teacher who showed us the 1960s movie that was made about the Scarlet Pimpernel. Now, I don't know how many people have heard of that anymore, because one time I tried to make a Gmail account or something and use that, and I found that there wasn't a bunch of people using that still. And then when I post any quotes from that book, I don't really see much of a reaction, but I'm assuming a lot of people still know about it, because there was movies made about it in the 20s and the 60s, and I think even the 80s. And this book is very fascinating, not only because it really explores the morality of the French Revolution and whatever, but it's kind of crazy because in the English in the book, the author was an English she had English royalty in her heritage, but she tries to get us to sympathize with the royalty, right? And I guess the English do sympathize, but she wrote that in the 1920s. This is long after most royalty has been removed. This is long after most Western countries have decided we're democracies now, or some form of that. And she really sets it from the point of view that here are these crazy revolutionaries, and they're just trying to murder people with any kind of royal lineage because they can, and they don't respect nothing, and this and that. And, here I am, a teenager, and I don't really understand all of this. All I just understand is that this guy has honor, and I'm trying to look for what honor is, and, sort of how that clashes and how it works in the real world. And so it was quite crazy to me. And but I fell in love with the book. There's so many great quotes, and of course I love the poem that they use throughout the book, where they search for him here, they search for him there. Those French, they search for him everywhere. But is he in heaven or is he in hell, that damned elusive Scarlet Pimpernel? So it's but that book, again, while that book was really a good book, it also barely scratches the surface of the morality in play during the French Revolution. Because then I happened upon, just because I've been quite active on Goodreads, and maybe I'll have to link everybody to Goodreads in my description of this episode, but I got suggested to me this author called Raphael Sabatini, who is an English-speaking author who is half Italian. And I was like, okay, whatever. It looks like he just wrote your standard run-of-the-mill swashbucklers when I read his first book called Captain Blood about some pirates, And I don't mind a swashbuckler. I like the idea of the fencing and everything because of the connection with my dad, but it's useless without any sort of, great setting behind it. You could just write a story about fencing on a boat, and, that's a whole bunch of novels that were written in the 1800s. And they're kind of drab. But Raphael Sabatini had this masterpiece work that he wrote in the 40s. And I don't know how he did this, but he just, conjured up the French Revolution and summed it up in the craziest way. And it's called Scaramouche. And it's a great novel. I won't divulge all of it. It keeps you on pins and needles the entire way through. There's so much action. I've never read a novel with more action than this book. And he just, maybe this is what inspired the Queen Bohemian Rhapsody song where they're like, Scaramouche, Scaramouche, will you do the fandango? I don't know. But Scaramouche was actually, I guess, an ancient Italian, or not an ancient Italian, a Renaissance Italian comedy figure. I don't know. But this book, the one I'm talking about by Raphael Sabatini, is set during the French Revolution. And, you know, you find out so many things about the class struggles of the day, and you start off the story sympathizing with the peasants in the uprising against the royalty establishment, and then by the end of the story you can't decide whether or not the sort of aristocracy of the French society is something that needs to be preserved or it's right or correct. And that's how you can really sort of, I think, set apart some authors from others. If everybody will allow me to rant a little longer in my own podcast. But if you just leave a novel or story assuming that there's just one way that's right and the other way is wrong, I don't think you've really gone full on deep in there. You know, there's a really great author leaves you hanging at the end, kind of, in my opinion, or maybe closes off the book, but leaves you really wondering deep inside what the question of the morality of the book is, or, you know, leaves you with a question philosophically that you can't answer. So, anyway, after I read that book, I was like, man, I really wish I could find more novels set during the French Revolution, because this just seems like a crazy time of upheaval, and it seems so current and relevant today in a political world that just seems in total turmoil. So I hunted and hunted and hunted, and it's been near impossible to get a hold of any of these books in libraries because most of them were written in the 1800s, and I prefer the audiobook medium, hence why I'm podcasting, I guess. But I found another book called 93 by the famed author Victor Hugo, who wrote he wrote that play that everybody loves that they just made a movie about, Les Miserables. And oh my gosh, the characters. You can't again, once you read this book, you can't decide was the aristocracy right or were the plebs right. I mean, obviously we all know that you shouldn't have a caste system, or at least we all think that a caste system is morally wrong. But you know, the morality at play and just like people's honor, it really strikes a deep chord inside you. So now why I brought all of this up is, with every novel set during the French Revolution, the outcome for France isn't really bad. I mean, obviously Napoleon took over, but that doesn't mean that France suffered because Napoleon took over. You could argue that French culture was at an all-time high in the 1800s. You know, though the aristocracy did die, France was still, I mean, all the famous paintings and philosophers and everything was just growing and exploding. And these novels, like I said, Dumas made a lot of money, and his stuff was translated into several languages, and so was there's plenty of other French authors. I can't remember them all offhand, but so that was such a great time. So that turmoil, though it led to a lot of turmoil and a lot of death, and really seems downright awful in hindsight, it did lead to really a great period for France. Well, the second contrasting period I want to talk about that I've read a lot of literature set during is the time leading up to World War II. And oh my gosh, it just seems like France is coming off the rails. And the first book I read about this, because I was a big Orwell fan, or at least I thought I was, and then I found out that basically 1984 borrowed a bunch of techniques from a bunch of other dystopian novels that are much more exciting. But we'll save that for another time. Oh, teenage me, so naive, thinks that these classic works are the only thing out there and there isn't anything under the surface. How wrong I was. Well, anyway, so I was like, well, I gotta read what else is famous from him. I've already read Animal Farm in 1984. So I read Down and Out in Paris and London. And that book opens in Paris, where he's poor. And I'm assuming Orwell lived poorly in Paris, although I don't think he lived as poorly as some. And I think he was just writing it as a reporter. He was originally a reporter. Him and Jack London were originally reporters. That's how come they had such a great insight into the human condition. Well, Orwell just describes this Paris, and you can tell that, like, on the outside, it's what they, in America, when they talk about the late 1800s being a Gilded Age, Paris in the 30s sounds like a total Gilded Age. On the outside, you have these people with these just really fancy, sophisticated restaurants with sophisticated cuisines, and all the workers in them are on the brink of starving from moment to moment. It's really quite wild, and the main character in that book is like a busboy, and he's just like, he's starving, like he's hustling to get any kind of food or anywhere to stay, and, there's refugees everywhere because, everybody's fleeing Germany and the Third Reich, and he's just barely getting by. In fact, it gets so bad that he decides, hey, I'm going to just move to London and be a homeless person in London because maybe it'll be better than Paris. So that's really wild. And then after that, I was like, well, there's got to be more about this subject matter. And what's really crazy is I just stumbled across this author, Eric Remarque. Well, I shouldn't say I just stumbled across him. I mean, everyone's heard of All's Quiet on the Western Front. But that's the only novel they've heard of. This guy on Goodreads, which is, I know it's not the only metric for how good a book is, but on Goodreads, he has several novels that are rated almost near perfect fives. And, oh my gosh, this man just captured the human existence. He captured it. But his most highly rated one on Goodreads, and probably his second most famous novel after All's Quiet on the Western Front, is called Arc de Triomphe. And this is actually set a little later than Down and Out. It's set in the 40s, right before the Germans come, pretty much. And it's the main character in there is a German refugee who's being an illegal doctor at nights because he's taking care of all these sick people that the French can't technically legally take care of, or there's some kind of situation, so he gets called in, and he basically has no papers. He doesn't exist. And if he gets caught, he gets thrown out because the French are trying to cut down on refugees. And all the sort of turbulation and trials he goes through, and French society, you're just like, wow. It's like the calm before the storm. Like, everybody in the novel and they're all so tense. They're all worried when the war is going to break out because they can tell it, they can feel it. They can feel that it's going to happen and that they're going to be affected. And you're just like, wow, this is what it looks like when sort of a society or culture as we know it, that's one that's, I don't know, I guess people could be proud of or say that it's definitely, I hate to always talk about Rome because that's what everybody talks about, but sort of like Rome before the fall, right? It's like these people are at their peak and everything's going great. And then, they can feel the Germans coming, though. They know they're at the gates, and that's going to be the sort of the end of Paris as it's known. And, oh my gosh, that novel just, it eats at it at the core, and you're just like, you don't know how to feel after you read it. I was so drained after I read that novel, I couldn't touch anything for another week, and I burned through it. I listened to it at work for I listened to it for 4 straight days at work and finished it during my 8 hours of work in the office. And I was just like, man, I'm so drained. I've never been so emotionally stirred up by anything before, and that's saying a lot for me, because prior to that, I'd already read at least 100 novels. And oh my gosh. So anyway, and the third one I wanted to talk about is, just as an aside, there's a book I'm on right now called A Coffin for Demetrios, written by the author Eric Ambler, who is an English author. And large parts of it are set in Paris during the 30s, and it's describing drug trafficking, a big heroin outbreak, and going after this drug dealer. But as an aside, it sort of, again, it highlights this Paris culture, like in one point he goes to meet one of the guys that's giving him information, and they go into this. He goes into this street where they're hiding, and it's 3 houses. 2 of them are abandoned, and one of them's only occupied on the 4th floor. And it's like wow, that describes what Paris was like then, getting hollowed out from within. So anyway, that's the podcast for this week. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you all enjoyed me rambling on about all this kind of nonsense. Anyway, so yeah, let me know what you think. Let me know if you think France is in decline, or what you think of those time periods, if you've read any of those novels, and let me know what you think about novels and their connection to place. I think it's very important that you establish good place if you're trying to write a good novel. Anyway, talk to you all next week. Check out the Know Your Place podcast on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/knowyourplacepodcast, all one word, or on Facebook at facebook.com/knowyourplacepodcast, all one word. And we will be coming soon to YouTube and iTunes, and maybe another social media platform near you. Special thanks to my wife, Sarah, and Jay Graff for the riff.